Okay, here's one. It's a kind of small article here, but makes a decent point, and it shows another pre-Clovis site that's been documented, and everybody's apparently liking this one. This just came out a couple of days ago, but they've been looking over the data for months and trying to debunk it themselves, believe it or not, and they can't do it. And so this is another good one to show you, and also another crack that opens in that foundation of the Amerindian hypothesis and and Clovis first. Now it says ancient people apparently followed rivers more than 500 kilometers inland to Cooper's Ferry in western Idaho. First people in the Americas came by sea, now they're saying. Ancient tools unearthed by Idaho River suggest. Now, we've talked recently, before I even get into this, about ancient boating. And the reason that they discount the Solutrean hypothesis was that there could have been no ancient boating. But yet they tell you that people made it to Australia 50,000 years ago, and they show depictions and art of cave drawings 16 and 20,000 years ago with a multi-manned boat. All of them seem to have a lot of all in there, over 20 people in these things, and pretty big sized boats and stuff. And so it strangely doesn't look like the hypothesis is going to stand up too much longer, and one wonders why it did for so long. But like in the recent video where I showed one of the reasons Glenn Beck got fired and so on is that they have a narrative that they want to keep going as long as they can, and then they can only slowly let it bleed to death. There will be no death scene happening. It must die a slow death over generations. They want something like one generation will kind of get the gist, and the next generation will kind of hear about it and think, flip a coin, and then the next generation will just be kind of like, oh, yeah, that must have happened, and meh, as opposed to doing, really getting behind the concept. So let's read here. About 16,000 years ago, on the banks of a river in western Idaho, people kindled fires shaped by stone blades and spear points and butchered large animals. And they found this type stuff. All were routine activities in prehistory, but their legacy day is anything but routine. The charcoal and bone left at the ancient site, now called Cooper's Ferry, are some 16,000 years old, which they are saying is the oldest radiocarbon dated record of human presence in North America, according to work reported this week in Science. And I think there's a few places that they have actually made that totally come into question. And they're going to say something about it at the very end, too, I believe. But there are sites that date back, like the Galt site and some of those others. Maybe the Galt site, a lot of it has been dated not necessarily off radiocarbon, but the fluoroscopy and how long something's been out of the light and all those things that they go with. I don't know if they can get away with that legally, because it dates back older than that. But then there's there's a Calico dig site in Southern California, in what they call Star Wars Valley. They filmed part of it there, most of it in Tunisia, and they go down over 70 foot to have done a test pit, and lo and behold, they found worked stone and stone that had been in fire and things, and it's about 200,000 years old. But I guess that's always been so much in question of reality that this is the one, or at least they're going to give this one the credit for being the oldest so far, that they really, really, really are going to confirm, as opposed to a myriad of other sites. Some of them, they've said such things as, well, there were people chipping stuff there, maybe, or some rock fell or something and just chipped just right next to a tree that caught on fire once, maybe due to lightning. But I don't think there's any people there. Let's just go on. The findings do more than add a few centuries to the timeline of peopling of the Americas. Dun dun dun. And also it gets a proto-pre-Clovis situation on, and that's not allowed with the old dogma. So all that has to be written. And so I wonder how many years it's going to be that before they teach this, or at least whenever they're trying to teach you the Clovis first idea, they mention this and a few others and say that it's been destroyed. But things like that happen because everything's always the oldest till we find the next. In fact, that's why I don't agree with say something is the oldest. It should be the oldest so far found. The very first boat, and that's the oldest boat found, because they're going to find another boat or something, just like they just did recently. You know, somebody, longest drive in golf history. And I said to my dad when I was younger, it was the longest drive so far. And he goes, oh, you think you're going to drive it far eventually? And I said, yeah, well, someone will. And so it's the longest drive so far. So far. It's not the longest drive in history, like now no one can touch it or anything. But it adds a few centuries to the timeline. They also shore up a new picture of how humans first arrived to the Americas by showing that people lived at Cooper's Ferry more than a millennium before melting glaciers even opened up an ice-free corridor through Canada at about 14,800 years ago. And if I'm not mistaken, they are stretching that number back now and trying to reach to this number. For it seems like they're adding about 2,600 years to that. But I could be wrong. But that number's floated around a little bit too. That implies that the first people in the Americas must have come by sea, by not going through the corridor, moving rapidly down the Pacific coast and up rivers. The dates from Cooper's Ferry fit real nicely with the coastal model that we're increasingly getting a census on from genetics and archaeology, says Jennifer Raff, a geneticist at the University of Kansas in Lawrence, who studies the peopling of the Americas. We've done a few videos recently too, and so she's got to be all over this data on the fact that there were Proto-Indo-Europeans as well as what we think of as the Inuit type Asiatics that came in and started becoming, the Americas. And it's not necessarily like an Oriental, Japanese, Chinese type person and stuff at all, but then they have a genetic that mixes with them, and then the X haplogroup that goes with them, and so on. And the closest match to that is around the Anatolian area and all of northern Europe. And then in U.S., the closest thing that matches it in area, even though it does reach out to the west, in the Indians that are still there, but the Indians that are right up around Lake Michigan and all the Great Lakes and into Canada seem to show twice as much or 3 times as much or more as you get in that one little area. So it's more northeast and such a far away from corridor that it looks like Solutrean can easily be a way of people coming over there too. The only thing is we don't find that Inuit type people over there in Scandinavian Denmark type, as well as we definitely do over near Siberia and more of the Alaskan area. And that's today though, not before, but I'm not trying to imply that they were there and left, but hey, what if they were there and they got all killed off in a giant explosion that happened, and the few that lived went this way instead of that way, and they were still Aleutians and Arctic Circle people, but they were more like from over there. Entirely possible. You'd have to find it in genetics and things like that, and that's just a theory now. But let's go on. The Clovis people, big game hunters, who made characteristic stone tools dated to about 13,000 years ago, were once thought to have been the first to reach the Americas, presumably through the ice-free corridor. Well, there they say 13,000 instead of 12,600, so see, it's a lot more than 1,000 years, regardless. But a handful of earlier sites have persuaded many researchers that the coastal route is more likely. Now, that statement and sentence is extremely important because they give up the fact right there that they knowingly have quite a few sites that predated the Clovis idea built all up that they've been holding off for. Let me say it again. But a handful of earlier sites have persuaded many researchers that the coastal route is more likely. And so it has to do with boats and things. Archaeologists have questioned the signs of occupation at some putative pre-Clovis sites, but the stone tools and dating at Cooper's Ferry passed the test with flying colors, says David Meltzer, an archaeologist at SMU in Dallas, Texas. It's pre-Clovis, I'm convinced. And I think we were getting kickback on him exactly on just the recent paper that I did a story on. And he was the one that was trying to go, but it doesn't show anything and it doesn't prove anything. And more research is needed. And it's funny how a site like this can be so undeniable that he can sit and try to deny it to a certain point, but at another point he has to tell you that, no man, we did this right, and Cooper's Ferry passes the test with flying colors, and that it's pre-Clovis, and he's convinced of it. One thing about the Solutreans, they had bigger weapons, spear points and things like that, and they looked like they were really attacking the big game that we try to say Clovis people were all over. And the way of the migration, a lot of people have in their mind that it would come down, and they don't go into Canada at all. They go right down the edge, make it into the Americas, and then start spreading over, like somehow that was the barrier. But right as soon as they flow into the Canada corridor, some go east, southeast, and some go south, and so on. And a different set of people, slightly, and the haplogroup that comes from it goes south. And they've said for a long time now that that had to be people that did have boating going on, because it just makes more sense with everything in the way that it works out. But they couldn't have had boating in between Alaska, Siberia, and South America. So that was always another question that was there too. And one of the reasons that I've always said somebody's going to find something someday and it's going to be undeniable. Well, I think we all realize that a lot of things have been found and they're undeniable, but they're not talked about. And things like this don't get talked about too. And like I said, I'm sure it's probably not going to get shown in the books and stuff and talked about at kids. If I was a teacher, I'd try to say, hey kids, guess what we just figured out today? But this site is huge that you're looking at right here. There is a white truck that's right off the tip of my thing, so I don't know if you can even see that, and a giant barn that's all off in this area. But it's said that this place used to flood up all over this whole thing, so the water would get up at least 15-20 foot higher through the whole area and flooded over this whole thing, and you can kind of see from the shape of that. But imagine they also said that this thing, whenever it ran hard during the day, back in the day, you can see a ledging cut into the side of the cliff here, and then as it would go up into this one, you can see it cut into the edge of the cliff right there. And that's some 60 foot above the current water level. And the odd thing is, they say whenever the water rushed through here at the end of the last glacial maximum after the flood, the problem that happened due to it, that it would have been up here at this water line that you see on this cliff, that actually requires there to be more than 6,000 times the amount of water flow that comes through here as a maximum currently. As to what does that? I'm sorry, they may have been saying 6,000 more than this makes that. No, I think it was the 6,000 more than the current, but that's huge. Somebody else said the same number in this idea for an area very similar to this, but not this area exactly. And Randall Carlson was talking about that in this place and a few others. And that whenever this flooded up to this line they're talking about, that only this little ridge right here would have been above water, and the water line would have been right about here, right about here, right about there. And you can see it still etched in right in here. It wouldn't have been very much above water. All this would have been underwater. And Randall Carlson talked about another site that they had, and he gave an idea of the water flow that was coming through it. And he took a little model at the same perspective, at the same distance as the Niagara Falls, and he put it in there, and it just was dwarfed by this whole ridge. And he said, well, water was coming over here at hundreds of times faster than the Niagara Falls, times the 100 width that's going on here, all the way through this whole valley to the point that it was submerged. Like when you see the Grand Canyon and you see that etched out from the top all the way down, and it V's down in there. Now, believe it or not, they say this whole thing was full of water at a time that was roaring through there and etched it out and then sunk. And you see some of those gaps are a mile across that had been through there, and you wonder what hell. And then you look at the Colorado, and of course it's been pinched off by dams and stuff upwind, but you look at it down there, and that's not the way this area happened at all. They say it happened quite rapidly too. So this is another version, though, of a showing that there were people coming in to the Americas. And what's the catchphrase, guys? Oh yeah, much earlier than previously thought. And at least they're trying to agree with this one. The little strange thing is they seem to be pushing Clovis back to it and trying to still attach it to him, and said, well, Clovis didn't even have to wait for the corridor. Clovis was before, and now they're going to swallow up the pre-Clovis with Clovis. And whenever you look at the points that come from these people that they equate to Solutreans and things, you're not able to do that quite right. Anyhow, guys, like, share, and subscribe, and enjoy. We're on to the next subject. Peace.